Because really the question of defining the architecture of the wage, defining what we mean by working time, how we calculate what the minimum wage is or what counts towards compliance, are issues that kind of bridge us between the setting and the design and then the implementation and enforcement. So luckily, much of the information that I'm going to present is in your packets in this folder. So you're welcome to open it up and follow along. Some of the graphs will be in there. The first thing is that there's actually no internationally legally binding definition of a national minimum wage or of its components. So the ILO Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations defines the minimum wage as the minimum sum payable to a worker or work performed for services rendered within a given time period, whether calculated on the basis of time or output. So it leaves open whether this is based only on working time or whether it could be a task system, which may not be reduced either by individual or collective agreement and is guaranteed by law, which may be fixed in any way as to cover the minimum needs of the worker and his or her family, as Neil pointed out. And so what's important to establish in defining the minimum wage is what components of remuneration count towards compliance, what reference period or over what reference period it's calculated, and then what counts as time worked. Now, the minimum wages, they might say it's important to have a simple definition that is easy to enforce, but it's also important to clearly define these components, because if they're not well defined from the beginning, it can then lead to both misimplementation and all sorts of legal questions later on. And that has been the case, for instance, in France. There have been debates in Germany as well. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. We have should I switch off? Anyway, to give you just a brief overview of what the case is in South Africa. So in South Africa, currently, minimum wages are determined sectorally, either through collective agreements or sectoral determinations, which are published by the Minister of Labor upon recommendation of the Employment Conditions Committee. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act then provides a legal framework for the regulation of minimum wages, and it defines some key terms. So the first term is remuneration, which it defines as any payment in money or in kind made to any person in return for work. But that is different from the term wages, which is defined as a component of remuneration paid in relation to the ordinary hours of work, which are, according to the BCDA, defined as a 45-hour work week, a 9-hour work day, if it's a 5-day week, or an 8-hour work day if it's a 6-day week. Premium payments for overtime work on Sundays and night work are also defined by the BCDA. They also define the permissible payroll deductions. However, what counts towards the wage is determined at the sectoral level, and therefore it varies. So, for instance, the net wage, employee contributions to the unemployment insurance fund, retirement fund, union dues, etc., are included across all sectors. But then, and I think it's in this booklet, I'm not going to describe it in great detail, but there are some things that are included in some sectors and not in others. So for instance, if we look at productivity and performance bonuses, piecework is prohibited in some collective bargaining agreements. So that raises the question, if piecework is going to be, if workers are going to be paid on the measure of output, and piecework is output, is a measure of output, what happens to sectors that currently do not allow piecework? The in-kind benefits is another one. So some sectors include deductions for food and or accommodation. Other sectors don't. Deductions for loans, goods purchased, etc. are also included in some sectoral determinations, although strictly regulated. Excluded in all sectoral determinations are premium payments, because these are overtime. They go beyond your ordinary hours of work, or their allowances for night work or extraordinary work. And then interestingly, tips and gratuities, which are not explicitly mentioned in all sectors, but for instance the hospitality sector, are also excluded. Now, on one of these pages of, let me see, we have a graph. So page 14 of this booklet has a graph. And on the bottom of the graph is net wages, and we basically go through all these components of minimum wage. And the argument based on the international literature is that the minimum wage, and this was mentioned also yesterday, is the basic wage, right? And the basic wage would include the net wage, employee contributions, and income tax. Now in South Africa, the tax threshold is above 6,000 rands. So that would be above what the proposal of COSATU is. So in reality, the difference that income tax would make would be minimal, most likely. Now, in terms of international experience, these three components, the basic wage is quite standard. But where it starts to get more complicated is when we start talking about productivity and performance pay. Like South Africa, many countries exclude, for instance, tips, because tips are very difficult to calculate. Even in centralized systems, there's all sorts of problems in terms of both calculation, enforcement, and the third, which is clarified in the German minimum wage law, is that tips are a gratuity. And when we look at countries like the United States that created two minimum wages, one for tipped workers and one for not, you see that this has had a real impact in terms of working poverty of tipped workers. Because basically the responsibility for paying a wage has been shifted to the consumer. And it's up to the consumer's discretion what wage they earn. Premiums for non-standard work are generally excluded from calculations of the minimum wage. In other words, they don't count for compliance towards compliance because they're premiums, and similarly allowances. So for instance, an allowance for night work would not necessarily be included. The other big question is whether to set minimum wages on an hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And this is actually something that Sean Godfrey raised yesterday, and that I hope that there can be a little bit more discussion about what that would mean and what the impact would be in South Africa. So currently in South Africa, you have a combination, and that's actually quite common internationally. But the challenge with hourly wages is that while it ensures that workers are paid for every hour worked, it does not guarantee that workers earn a minimum wage over a longer reference period. So for instance, if a worker earns the minimum wage on an hourly basis and works 2 hours a day, at the end of the month, they're not going to be earning the minimum required as defined in the earlier presentations. Daily, monthly, or weekly wages, so wages over a longer reference period, can start to address this challenge. On the other hand, if minimum wages are not defined on an hourly basis, it is important to specify the hours of work in order to ensure that workers are not forced to work overtime or without any additional compensation. So for instance, if you're paid on a monthly basis, based on a calculation of ordinary hours of work of 45 hours, but you're actually working 60 or 70, then those are hours that you're forfeiting in terms of overtime. So it's important to clearly identify. Now there are some interesting approaches both in South Africa, actually, through the sectoral determination, as well as internationally, to try to ensure a minimum income over a longer reference period for hourly workers. So there's sort of three different ways that have been tried in South Africa, but also in some other countries. So the first one is to limit the categories of work that can be paid on an hourly basis. So for instance, in South Africa today, workers in the private security sector can only be paid on an hourly basis if they work 24 hours or less. Beyond that, workers must be paid according to a monthly rate. Okay. The second thing is to establish higher wage rates for part-time workers. So for instance, in South Africa, in the private security sector, casual workers receive an additional 15% over the prescribed hourly wage of full-time employees. In retail and wholesale sector, employees who work less than 27 hours a week are paid 25% above the hourly wage, though here they forfeit their right to premium payment. So there's sort of, you can see that there's different approaches within sectors in South Africa. But in Malaysia also, the daily rate is higher for workers who work less days but more hours in a week. This to try to ensure that even if you're working fewer days, but in the total hours, you're earning them the same as people that will be working more days. So, and then the third approach is to stipulate a minimum number of hours of work per day. So here in South Africa, you see in the contract and cleaning sector, an employee must be paid for a minimum of 6 hours on any given day, even if they work less than that. In the private security sector and domestic work sector, an employee who works less than 4 hours a day is deemed to have worked 4 hours a day. So at least it doesn't ensure you a full day's work, but it does try to create incentives to ensure at least a minimum number of hours, which would get you closer to what is a minimum wage over a monthly reference period. The final thing that I just wanted to talk about is the international approaches to defining what counts as time worked. So it's important to clearly identify how the minimum wage is going to be calculated, right? So, and then here countries vary. So you can look at actual working time, which includes breaks and periods of leave. They would only take into account the time when workers are actually doing the task at hand. There's ordinary hours of work, which is what is used in South Africa, which includes statutory breaks. So let's say if 1 hour lunch was mandated, it's not, but in South African law, then you would be there for 9 hours, you would do your task for 8, and you would have that 1 hour. But South Africa does, for instance, include breaks. So those breaks are included in the South African context. And then there's full working time, which includes all time when workers are required to be at work, even if for some reason they're unable to work. So that would include, for instance, if they're doing standby work. And of course, you can imagine already that depending on the profession, their relevance of each one of these might differ slightly. But in the context of South Africa, and given already what the approach is, it seems like a focus on ordinary hours of work, but that takes into account full working time, including standby work, could be considered. So, in conclusion, while there's no single approach to defining the national minimum wage, it's important to ensure the definitions of what counts as time worked, the reference period, and the components of remuneration are clearly defined and easy to comply with. The national minimum wage always includes the basic wage. Productivity and performance pay with top-ups by employers when these fall below the national minimum wage levels might safeguard incentive pay while ensuring that workers do not earn above the national minimum wage. So for instance, in sectors where commissions are really important, it may be decided that that's essential. But then, as we heard from the presentation in Malaysia, including commissions, when your basic pay is very, very low, actually has an implication in terms of the contributions to social insurance and other factors. So it's important to look at these questions. Given the South African context, the inclusion of tips and piecework should be discouraged. It conflicts with existing legislation. And an approach that combines an hourly, weekly, monthly reference period is probably what should be considered, but taking into account the ways in which, or measures that might help to ensure or guarantee workers a minimum wage over a longer reference period. So thank you very much, and I hope it was clear. You can always ask